I've always believed silence speaks louder than words. But it wasn't until the week of my 50th birthday that I learned how to truly listen to it. It started with a pause. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that settles between two people who've shared decades of quiet mornings and unspoken understandings. No, this was a different silence. Sharp, sudden, like a record scratch in the middle of a lullaby. I was standing in the hallway outside the living room, holding a basket of laundry fresh from the dryer. The scent of lavender detergent clung to the towels, warm and familiar. Through the half-open door, I saw Robert and his sister Beatrice huddled near the fireplace. They were leaning in, heads almost touching, voices so low they were little more than breath. Then my foot creaked on the old oak floorboard. They froze. Beatrice straightened first, smoothing her silk blouse with practiced grace. Robert turned slowly, his smile already in place, but his eyes were still caught in whatever secret they'd been weaving. "Ellie," he said, too cheerfully. "Didn't hear you come in." "I didn't make a sound," I replied, setting the basket down. Beatrice laughed, a light, tinkling sound that never quite reached her eyes. "We were just finalizing the guest list for your party. Robert's gone all out. You'll be speechless." I almost smiled. Almost. But something in the way she said speechless made my stomach tighten. Later that evening, over a dinner of roasted chicken and asparagus, Robert's favorite, he handed me a small velvet box. Black, heavy, tied with a silver ribbon. "Happy early birthday, love," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. I opened it slowly. Inside, nestled in white satin, was a diamond pendant. Not just any diamond, a teardrop-shaped stone, flawless, catching the candlelight like a frozen tear from a star. The chain was platinum, delicate but strong. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "It's nothing compared to you," he said, fastening it around my neck. His fingers brushed my collarbone, once warm, now oddly clinical. "Wear it to the party. I want everyone to see how proud I am of you." The party. His colossal celebration. He'd been planning it for weeks. Caterers from San Francisco, a live jazz trio, floral arrangements flown in from Holland. I'd asked for a simple dinner with close friends. He'd waved the idea away. "This is your milestone, Ellie. You deserve grandeur. But grandeur feels different when it's not yours to choose." That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror long after Robert had gone to bed. The diamond glinted cold against my skin. I touched it. It didn't warm. Gifts from the heart carry warmth. This one carried weight. The next morning, I found Beatrice in the kitchen, pouring coffee. She didn't offer me a cup. "He's trying so hard," she said without looking up. "After everything. He wants this to be perfect." "After everything?" I asked. She glanced at me, then just a flicker, and stirred her coffee 3 times, clockwise. "You know what I mean." I didn't, but I nodded anyway. It was easier than asking. Over the next 2 days, the house filled with deliveries, custom linens, crystal glasses, a cake tasting with 6 different frostings. Robert hovered near me constantly, asking if I was feeling okay, if I needed anything, if I was excited. His attention felt less like care and more like surveillance. And the whispers returned. Once, in the study, I heard him say, "As long as she wears it, it'll be fine." Another time, Beatrice murmured, "She's smarter than you think." I began noticing other things, too. The way Robert checked his phone under the dinner table. How he'd grown distant over the past year, not angry, not cruel, just absent. Like he'd already packed his emotional bags and was waiting for the right moment to leave. But why throw a party to say goodbye? Then it hit me, this wasn't a celebration, it was a performance. And I was the unwitting star of a show I hadn't agreed to be in. On the morning of the 3rd day before the party, I stood in our walk-in closet, staring at the dress Robert had chosen for me, a deep emerald gown, elegant, expensive. It hung like a question mark in the dim light. I touched the diamond again. Cold, heavy, final. I remembered our early years, how we dreamed of opening a bed and breakfast in Napa, how we'd saved coins in a mason jar for our someday. Back then, love wasn't measured in carrots or caterers. It was in shared silence that felt like home. Now, the silence felt like a warning. That afternoon, while Robert was on a business call in the garage, I walked into the living room and stood exactly where I'd been the day I first heard them whisper. I closed my eyes and listened, nothing. But the air still felt charged like the moment before lightning strikes. I knew then. Something was coming. Something big. And whatever it was, it had already been decided without me. All that remained was for the curtain to rise, and for me to decide whether I'd play the role they'd written, or rewrite the script myself. The morning after I fastened the diamond around my neck, I woke with a quiet certainty. Something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong you can fix with a conversation or a shared bottle of wine. This was deeper, like a crack running through the foundation of a house you thought was solid. I made coffee the way I always did, 2 scoops, filtered water, a splash of oat milk. The routine soothed me, but my hands trembled slightly as I poured. I told myself it was just nerves about the party, but my gut knew better. Robert had left early for a client meeting. Beatrice was out of town, or so he said. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of sparrows in the garden. It was the kind of silence that invites truth. I needed a recipe, a lemon tart, to bring to Marjorie's book club that afternoon. Something simple, something normal. I opened Robert's laptop on the kitchen island. His password was still our wedding date, unchanged in 23 years. A small comfort, or perhaps a cruel irony. As the browser loaded, I noticed the history bar was still visible. I didn't mean to look, but there it was. Community property divorce, California. Can a spouse waive pension rights? How to protect assets before separation. My breath caught. I clicked back. More entries. Dozens of them, all from the past 6 weeks. Legal forums. Financial advisors. A PDF titled "The Nuptial Agreement Template." Enforceable? My fingers went numb. The screen blurred. This wasn't planning a party. This was planning an exit. I sat very still. The coffee steamed beside me, forgotten. Outside, a breeze lifted the curtains, letting in the scent of jasmine from the trellis by the patio. It should have been peaceful, but all I felt was cold. I closed the browser, then opened it again. I needed proof. Not for him, for me. So I couldn't talk myself out of what I was seeing. I found a folder labeled Event Planning. Inside, invoices, catering, floral design, and one line that made my stomach drop. Final payment, $60,000. The Ellie Experience, full production, $60,000. On a party I never asked for. Paid from our joint savings account, the one we used for vacations, for home repairs, for the emergency fund we'd built after my father's illness. I stared at the number. It wasn't just money. It was a message. A performance budgeted like a corporate launch. And I was the product being retired. I shut the laptop. My heart pounded, but my face felt calm. That's the thing about turning 50, you learn to hold your storms inside. Then the phone rang. It was Marjorie. Ellie. Her voice was soft, hesitant. I didn't know if I should call. Of course you should, I said, my voice steady. What is it? She paused. I heard her take a breath. I saw Robert today, at Bistro Lumiere, the one downtown. My throat tightened. Okay, he wasn't alone. I didn't speak. I just waited. He was with a woman. Young, blonde, wearing a white dress. They were holding hands, Ellie, laughing like they were the only 2 people in the room. I closed my eyes. The image formed instantly. Robert's easy smile, the one he used to save for me, now aimed at someone else. His hand broad, familiar, wrapped around fingers that weren't mine. What's her name? I asked. I don't know, but I asked the hostess. She said they come in every Thursday. For lunch. Every Thursday for how long? Thank you, Marjorie, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You did the right thing. I hung up. Then I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. Tired, but not broken. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The distance, the whispers, the sudden attention, the diamond a distraction, the party a stage. And this woman, Chloe, I'd learn her name soon enough, wasn't just a mistress. She was part of the plan. They weren't just ending our marriage. They were trying to erase me. Financially, emotionally, publicly. But here's what Robert forgot. Before I was his wife, I was Ellie Morgan, CPA. I spent 15 years untangling lies hidden in balance sheets and tax returns. I know how money talks. And right now, it was screaming. I dried my face, walked back to the laptop. This time, I didn't just browse, I dug. I found the hidden credit card, not in his name, but under a shell LLC he'd created last year. Riverside Holdings. Clever, but not clever enough. The statement showed jewelry stores, weekend stays in Carmel, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, all charged in the past for months. All for her. And then, buried in a subfolder labeled personal, I found a photo. Robert and Chloe, arms around each other, standing in front of a vineyard. Napa Valley, my vineyard. The dream I'd whispered to him on our honeymoon, the one he'd called quaint but impractical, the one I'd tucked away and never mentioned again. Now he was showing it to her as if it were his to give. I sat back. The rage didn't come roaring. It settled in my bones like winter frost, quiet, sharp, and utterly clear. They thought I was asleep, but I was wide awake, and I knew exactly what I had to do. Grief has many faces. Mine wore a calculator the morning after Marjorie's call. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I made a pot of black tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my old leather notebook, the one with the faded gold corners I hadn't touched in over a decade. The spine cracked like a whisper from the past. Ellie Morgan, CPA. The title felt foreign, like a name I'd outgrown. But not today. Today, that woman was exactly who I needed to be. Robert thought he'd buried our financial life under layers of joint accounts and shared passwords. But he forgot one thing. I built this system. I knew where every wire led. I started with the joint savings, the one labeled future fund, the one we'd promised would pay for our retirement, our travels, maybe even that little vineyard dream I'd stopped mentioning. I logged in under my credentials, still valid, still trusted. The balance was lower than it should have been, not drastically, but enough to raise a red flag in the mind of someone who once audited Fortune 500 companies for a living. I pulled the last 6 months of transactions. There it was. A recurring transfer every second Friday. $2 to 1,500. To an account I didn't recognize. Riverside Holdings LLC. The same shell company from the credit card. I opened my laptop again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I used Robert's fingerprint while he showered. His thumb still unlocked the device. Even after all this time, a small betrayal for a larger truth did in his email. I found the credit card statement, not the joint Amex we used for groceries and gas. This was a private card issued in his name only, with a black titanium finish. The kind banks offered to clients they don't question. I scrolled through the charges. March 12th. Tiffany & Co. $8,000 to $100. April 3rd. The Carmel Inn. 2-night stay. $1,850. April 18th. Nobu Malibu. Dinner for two. $620. May 1st. Private jet charter. SFO to LAS. $4,300. And then, May 10th. Chloe A. Personal shopping. Neiman Marcus. $3,100. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. The accountant in me took over, calm, methodical, relentless. I printed every page, highlighted every transaction, filed them in chronological order in a manila folder I labeled simply evidence. But the real blow came when I cross-referenced the event planner's invoice I'd seen earlier. The payment of $60,000 hadn't come from Robert's business account. It hadn't come from his secret card. It had been pulled directly from our joint savings, the future fund, on April 28th. 1 week after he'd told me we couldn't afford to replace the roof. I sat back. The kitchen sunlight streamed through the window, warm on my skin. But inside, I felt like ice. $60,000, not for a celebration, for a spectacle. He wasn't just leaving me. He was staging my public unraveling and funding it with the money we'd saved to grow old together. I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. There, tucked behind my winter coats, was my old briefcase. Brown leather, brass clasps, scuffed at the corners. I hadn't used it since I left the firm to focus on family after Robert's promotion. I wiped the dust off with my sleeve. That afternoon, I drove to the downtown branch of our bank. I wore my pearls, my mother's, and the diamond pendant Robert gave me. Let them think I was just a wife checking on party expenses. But when I sat across from the branch manager, I didn't ask about the party. I need a full forensic audit of all accounts linked to Robert and Eleanor Morgan, I said, my voice steady. Joint, individual, and any LLCs tied to either of us. I also need copies of every wire transfer, credit application, and authorization form from the past 2 years. The manager blinked. Is there a legal matter? Not yet, I said, but there will be. I left with a sealed envelope of documents and a new sense of purpose. On the drive home, I passed the florist Robert had hired for the party. Through the window, I saw a mock-up of the centerpiece. White roses, gold ribbon, and a tiny card that read to Ellie 50 years of light. I almost laughed. 50 years of light. I'd barely lived half that, but as I turned onto our street, I realized something. The pain was still there, but it no longer owned me. It had been replaced by something sharper, cleaner. Clarity. Robert had awakened the wrong version of me. He thought he was dealing with a quiet wife who'd fade away when pushed. But the woman sitting in that car, the one with spreadsheets in her purse and fire in her bones, wasn't going anywhere. She was just getting started. And she remembered every dollar, every lie, every whispered plan meant to break her. Now she had the receipts. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, not by email, not by text, but the old-fashioned way, thick cream paper, sealed with red wax stamped with the initials HWL. My heart stuttered when I saw it. I hadn't seen that seal in over a decade. Helen Winthrop Langley, my great-aunt Helen, had been writing me letters since I was 12. Long, looping script on handmade paper, filled with stories of her travels, her garden, and her quiet rebellion against a world that told women like us to stay small. She'd never married, never apologized, and she'd always believed I was capable of more than I let myself be. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The scent of lavender and aged paper rose from the page, her signature. But the letter wasn't from her. It was from a law firm in San Francisco. Dear Ms. Eleanor Morgan, it began. It is with deep respect and sorrow that we inform you of the passing of Ms. Helen Winthrop Langley on May 3, 2025. I sat down hard on the porch step. The sun was warm on my shoulders, but my hands went cold. Aunt Helen gone. Just like that. No warning. No final letter. Just silence. I kept reading. In accordance with her last will and testament, you are named sole beneficiary of her entire estate, which includes a sum of $2,500. 0 in liquid assets, a fully owned penthouse apartment at 45 Central Park South, New York City, and Langley Vineyards, a 22-acre operational winery in St. Helena, Napa Valley, California. I dropped the letter. The vineyard, our vineyard, not ours, really, but the dream Robert and I had whispered about on our honeymoon in Sonoma back when we still believed in someday. I'd sketched floor plans on napkins. He joked about naming a Cabernet after me, but within a year, he called it a fantasy for poets, not accountants, and I'd folded the dream away. Like an old sweater I no longer had room to wear now. It was mine, all of it. I read the letter 3 more times, as if the words might change. But they didn't. They only grew heavier, more real. That afternoon, I drove to the post office and sent a certified request for the full will and property deeds. By evening, I was on the phone with the managing attorney, a woman named Diane Cho, whose voice was calm and precise. She left you everything because she believed you'd been dimmed by duty, Diane said gently. Her words, not mine. She said you'd forgotten your own light, but she never did. I hung up and walked to the backyard. The garden was blooming peonies, lavender, climbing roses Robert never watered, but I kept alive anyway. I knelt in the dirt, pressing my palms into the soil. It was cool, rich, alive. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel trapped. I felt seen. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney I'd worked with years ago, someone outside Robert's circle. Her name was Miriam Hayes. Sharp, discreet, unimpressed by charm. I need to protect an inheritance, I said. Immediately, she didn't ask why. She just said, bring the documents. By noon, I'd transferred the $2.5 million into a new trust under my maiden name, Eleanor Morgan, sole beneficiary. The penthouse deed was filed with a privacy shield. And the vineyard? The title was already in my name, clean and clear, dated to months before Aunt Helen's passing. She transferred it while she was still healthy, Miriam said, scanning the deed. Smart woman. Yes, I said. She was. That night, I stood in the kitchen, the diamond pendant still around my neck, and opened my laptop one last time. I searched Langley Vineyards. Up popped a website elegant, understated. Photos of sun-drenched vines, a stone farmhouse, barrels in a cool cellar, a tasting room with wide windows overlooking the valley, and a note. Family owned since 1947. Crafting truth in every bottle. I touched the screen. Robert had laughed at this dream. Now, it was my lifeline. I thought of the $60,000 he'd stolen from our future to fund my humiliation, of Chloe's hand in his, of Beatrice's cold eyes. They thought they were writing my ending. But Aunt Helen had handed me a new beginning, and it came with roots deep enough to survive any storm. I poured myself a glass of the cheap Pinot Noir we kept in the fridge. The one Robert said was fine for weeknights. I raised it to the window, where the first stars were blinking awake. To you, Aunt Helen, I whispered. Thank you for remembering who I really am. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a secret being passed between old friends. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt ready. By the time I walked into Miriam Hayes's office for the second time, I wasn't just Ellie Morgan, wife and accountant. I was Ellie Morgan, strategist. The rain had started that morning, soft at first, then steady, and it followed me all the way downtown, drumming against the windshield like a quiet warning. I didn't mind. Rain always made me think clearer. It washed the noise away. Miriam didn't offer small talk. She handed me a manila folder and said, "They're not just divorcing you, Ellie. They're trying to dismantle you." Inside were printed emails between Robert and Beatrice. Not love letters, battle plans. If we do it at the party, in front of everyone, she'll be too humiliated to fight. Beatrice had written, "She's emotional. She'll sign anything to make it stop." Robert's reply, "As long as she's wearing the necklace, it'll look like a gift, not a trap." I read the words slowly. My hands stayed steady, but something inside me hardened like wet clay fired in a kiln. They drafted a separation agreement. Miriam continued, tapping a document. "It waives your claim to his pension, gives you only 10% of the marital assets, and includes a non-disclosure clause so you can't even speak about the marriage publicly." They were going to hand it to you right after his speech while you were still crying in the bathroom. Probably. I looked out the window. Raindrops slid down the glass, merging, falling. "They think I'm fragile." "You're not," Miriam said, "but they don't know that yet." Then she leaned forward. "Now, here's where it gets interesting." She pulled out another file, this one older, labeled Seaview Property -2012. "The beach house," I whispered. "Yes, the one your grandmother left you after she passed. You used that inheritance $320,000 to buy it outright." Robert handled the paperwork. "He told you he'd put both names on the title." I nodded. "He said it was ours. A fresh start after my mother died." Miriam's eyes held mine. "He didn't." I blinked. "What?" "The deed is in your name only. Sole ownership. No joint tenancy. No right of survivorship. Just Eleanor Morgan." I sat very still. The beach house wasn't just a property. It was where I'd scattered my mother's ashes, where Robert proposed on the deck at sunset, with the Pacific stretching forever behind him, where we'd spent every summer for 20 years, watching the tides roll in and out like the rhythm of our love, or so I'd thought. Now, it was my first real weapon, Miriam explained, because the house was purchased with my separate inheritance, and never legally shared. It couldn't be touched in a divorce, not even by Robert's cleverest lawyer. And because it had appreciated to over $1.8 million, it gave me leverage, real, tangible power. "They wanted to strip you bare," Miriam said, "but they forgot you already owned something they couldn't take." I left her office with 2 new documents, a restraining order on any further transfers from our joint accounts, and a notarized affidavit securing the beach house under my sole control. That evening, I drove to the coast. The house stood as it always had, weathered cedar shingles, white trim, the porch swing creaking in the salt wind. I unlocked the door. The air inside smelled of pine cleaner and old memories. I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet. There, in a showbox on the top shelf, was the deed. I'd never looked at it. I'd trusted him. Now I traced my name on the paper with my finger. Eleanor Morgan, not and Robert. Just me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the ocean roaring beyond the dunes. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim of their plot. I felt like a player in my own game, and I knew the rules better than they did. Over the next 2 days, I moved quietly. I opened a new safe deposit box. I copied every financial record, every email, every photo of Robert and Chloe. I even recorded a voice memo describing the timeline of his deception just in case. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I played the part he expected. The grateful wife. The doting hostess. I smiled when he asked if I'd picked out shoes for the party. I nodded when he said, "You'll look radiant in that dress." I even thanked him again for the diamond. All the while, I was building my fortress one truth at a time. The night before the party, I stood on the beach, the cold sand between my toes, and watched the moonlight ripple across the waves. The pendant hung heavy around my neck, but it no longer felt like a chain, it felt like armor. Robert thought the party was his stage, but he hadn't realized yet. The script had changed, and the woman walking into that ballroom wouldn't be the one he'd written. She'd be the one who rewrote everything. The week before the party, I became an actress. Not the kind who commands a spotlight, but the kind who disappears so completely into a role that no one suspects she's playing one at all. I smiled when Robert mentioned the guest list. I nodded when Beatrice called to confirm the floral arrangements. I even let him adjust the diamond pendant around my neck, his fingers brushing my skin like he still had a right to touch me. All the while, I was building my arsenal. On Monday morning, I transferred the $2.5 million inheritance into 3 separate trusts, each under my maiden name, each with ironclad privacy clauses. The penthouse deed was filed with a New York title shield. The Vineyard. I'd already spoken to the estate manager. He'd been with Aunt Helen for 20 years. "Langley Vineyards answers to you now, Mum," he'd said over the phone. Not to anyone else. Tuesday, I met Miriam at a quiet cafe downtown. No names were spoken aloud. Just folders passed under the table like secrets. Inside, certified copies of the beach house deed, the LLC credit card statements, the $60,000 invoice for the Ellie experience, and screenshots of Robert's emails with Beatrice. Every document was notarized, time-stamped, and backed up in 3 locations, including a safety deposit box under a false name. Wednesday, I wrote my speech, not on paper, never on paper. I composed it in my head while folding laundry, while watering the garden, while listening to Robert hum in the shower. I shaped each sentence like a blade, smooth, precise, lethal only when needed. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. And truth, I learned, doesn't need shouting. It just needs a microphone and an audience willing to listen. Thursday, I visited the beach house one last time. I walked through every room, touching the walls like I was saying goodbye to an old friend. In the study, I found the photo album from our first summer there, Robert grinning on the dock, me with my hair loose in the wind. I didn't burn it. I tucked it into my bag. Some memories are worth keeping, even when the person in them is in single quotes. Friday, I rehearsed. Not the words, those were already carved into my bones, but the posture, the pause, the way I'd walk to the podium after Robert's speech, calm as dawn. I practiced in front of the mirror, the diamond glinting cold against my throat. I made sure my hands wouldn't shake, my voice wouldn't crack, my eyes wouldn't water. They expected a collapse. I would give them clarity. Saturday, the day before the party, I dressed in my favorite linen dress. The soft blue one Robert always said made my eyes look like the sea before a storm. I made his favorite dinner, seared salmon, roasted fennel, a glass of that overpriced Bordeaux he loved. He was in high spirits, looser than I'd seen him in months. "You look beautiful," he said, pouring me a glass of wine I didn't drink. "So do you," I replied, smiling over the rim of my untouched glass. After dinner, he stood behind me on the patio, his arms circling my waist like we were still a couple. The sunset bled gold across the sky. Crickets sang in the grass. It could have been any other evening in our 23 years. Then he kissed the top of my head and whispered, "Tomorrow will be a day you'll never forget, Ellie." I turned in his arms, looked up at him, really looked at the lines around his eyes, the confidence in his smile, the absolute certainty that he'd already won. I smiled back, soft, sweet, deadly. "Oh, I know, darling," I said, my voice like honey laced with arsenic. "I've been feeling that way too." He laughed, kissed my cheek, went inside to watch the game. I stayed on the patio until the stars came out in my pocket. My phone buzzed. A text from Miriam. "All documents are locked. You're ready." I looked up at the sky, vast, ancient, indifferent to human schemes. Tomorrow, the stage would be full of guests, champagne, and lies. But I wouldn't be the victim in their play. I'd be the author, and the final chapter was mine to write. The night of my 50th birthday arrived wrapped in gold, foil and false smiles. The ballroom at the Grand Meridian shimmered under crystal chandeliers. White orchids dripped from every archway. Waiters in black ties glided between guests holding flutes of champagne. That cost more than my first car. Everyone was here: Robert's business partners, our so-called friends, even my old college roommate, who gave me a look that said, "I told you so," without saying a word. And I wore the diamond. It hung cold against my collarbone, heavy as a verdict. The emerald gown Robert chose for me hugged my frame like a second skin, elegant, expensive, and utterly hollow. I smiled. I accepted compliments. I thanked people for coming, all while counting the minutes until the trap snapped shut. Robert stayed close all evening, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, a gesture meant to look tender, but it felt like a leash. At precisely 8:30 p.m., the string quartet fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert announced, stepping onto the raised platform at the front of the room. He adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, a gift I'd given him on our 20th anniversary, and smiled that practiced boardroom smile. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Eleanor Ellie on this milestone birthday." Polite applause. "She's been my rock for over 2 decades, he continued, his voice warm, smooth as aged whiskey. "A devoted wife, a quiet force, the kind of woman who puts everyone else first." I stood near the edge of the crowd, glass in hand, watching him weave his fiction. He spoke of my grace, my patience, my unwavering support. Each word was a nail in a coffin he'd built for me. Then, his tone shifted. "But even the strongest foundations can crack," he said, lowering his voice just enough to make the room lean in. "And sometimes, love isn't enough." A hush fell. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "I've come to realize that Ellie and I have grown in different directions," he went on, eyes scanning the crowd, never quite landing on me. "And so, with a heavy heart, I must share that we've decided to part ways." Gasps, murmurs. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes, whether from shock or performance. I couldn't tell. Then he did it. He turned toward the side door, and there she was, Chloe. Blonde hair swept into a soft chignon, a blush pink dress that screamed new beginning. She stepped forward, hesitant, like a debutante at her first ball. "This is Chloe," Robert said, taking her hand. "She's been my light during a very dark time. And tonight, I wanted you all to meet the woman I'll be building my future with." The room exploded, not in outrage, but in the kind of stunned silence that follows a gunshot. All eyes turned to me. They expected tears, a collapse, a shattered woman fleeing in humiliation. But I didn't move. I set my untouched champagne on a passing tray, smoothed the skirt of my gown, and walked forward. The crowd parted like water. Robert, still holding Chloe's hand, looked at me with wide eyes, half fear, half triumph. He gestured to the microphone on the stand beside him, offering it like a peace treaty. "Ellie," he said softly, for the room to hear, "would you like to say a few words?" I took the mic. My fingers didn't tremble. My breath didn't catch. The diamond pressed into my skin, but I barely felt it anymore, because in that moment, I wasn't the woman they thought I was. I was the woman I'd always been, just finally awake. I looked out at the sea of faces, some pitying, some curious, a few already reaching for their phones. Then I glanced at Chloe, who couldn't meet my gaze, and finally, at Robert, His smile was frozen, waiting for me to break. Instead, I smiled back. "Thank you, Robert," I said, my voice clear, calm, carrying to every corner of the room. "Now, it's my turn." And with that, I stepped fully into the light. The microphone felt cool in my hand. Solid. Real. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of Robert's betrayal to settle over the room like a shroud. Then I spoke quietly, clearly, without anger. Anger would have made them pity me. Calm would make them believe me. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "Now, it's my turn." I saw Chloe flinch. Beatrice stiffened near the champagne fountain. Robert's smile didn't drop, but his eyes narrowed, just slightly. He thought I'd crumble. Instead, I was about to rebuild myself in front of everyone who ever doubted me. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," I began, my voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed ballroom. "Especially Robert. He went to such great lengths to make this evening unforgettable." A few nervous laughs. I let them fade. "You see," I continued, "while Robert was planning this party, I was planning something else. Clarity." I paused, looked directly at him. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that our joint savings account had been drained by $60,000. Not for an emergency, not for a dream, but for this. I gestured around the room, the orchids, the string quartet, the hired wait staff, for what Robert called the Ellie experience, a farewell show, paid for with the money we saved to grow old together. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. "But that wasn't the only secret," I said, my tone still gentle, almost conversational. "While Robert told me he was working late, he was actually building a new life with Chloe." I turned to her. She looked pale, her hands clutching her clutch like a lifeline. "Did he tell you he used a secret credit card under a fake company to buy you jewelry? Weekend trips to Carmel? Dinner at Nobu? All while telling me we couldn't afford to fix the roof?" Chloe's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Robert, searching for an answer he couldn't give. "And the beach house?" I went on. "The one where he proposed? The one we spent every summer for 20 years? He told me it was ours, but the deed signed with my inheritance after my mother passed has only my name on it. It always has." I let that sink in. Then, I took a slow breath. But here's what truly changed everything. I reached into my small clutch and held up a single sheet of paper, just enough for the front row to see the embossed letterhead. "Last week, I learned my great-aunt Helen left me her entire estate, $2.5 million in cash, a penthouse in New York City, and Langley Vineyards in Napa Valley." A collective intake of breath. Robert's face went slack. He knew that name. He'd stood with me on that very land once, years ago, and called it a pretty fantasy. "It's not a fantasy anymore," I said, as if reading his mind. "It's my future." I stepped closer to the edge of the platform, my gaze sweeping the room not with shame, but with quiet authority. "Robert didn't throw this party to honor me," I said. "He threw it to break me, to humiliate me in front of all of you so I'd sign a divorce agreement that left me with nothing. He thought grief would make me weak." I smiled, then small, serene. "He forgot that grief can also make you fearless." I turned fully to Chloe now. Her mascara was smudged. Her perfect posture had collapsed into something fragile. "I don't blame you," I said softly. "You were just part of the performance. But I truly hope your love survives what comes next." I leaned slightly into the mic, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the room. "Because Robert has nothing left to offer you now. No savings. No beach house, no vineyard dream, just debt, secrets, and a reputation in ruins." I straightened. "So enjoy the party," I said, glancing around at the glittering room. "It's the last one he'll ever afford." Then I placed the microphone gently back on the stand. No applause, no shouts, just silence, thick, stunned, reverent, and in that silence, I walked away from the stage, from Robert, from the life he tried to bury me in. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had just reclaimed her name, her worth, and her future. The silence didn't last long. It shattered like thin glass the moment I stepped down from the platform. Whispers erupted, first in clusters, then in waves rippling through the ballroom like a storm rolling in off the ocean. Someone dropped a champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor, and no one moved to clean it. Robert stood frozen on stage, still holding Chloe's hand, though she was already pulling away. Her face was ghost white, her eyes wide with the dawning horror that she hadn't been chosen for love but for convenience. And now, in front of 200 people, she'd been exposed as the centerpiece of a cruel performance. I walked slowly toward the exit, my heels clicking softly against the floor. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the collapse behind me like heat from a burning house. Ellie. The voice came from my left. Martin Reeves, Robert's business partner of 15 years. He stood near the bar, his tumbler of whiskey untouched, his expression unreadable. You knew, he said quietly. I found out. I corrected. There's a difference. He nodded slowly, then turned and walked away, not toward Robert, but toward the coat check. I saw him hand his ticket to the attendant. He wouldn't be staying, and I knew, with cold certainty, that their partnership wouldn't survive the week. Behind me, the murmurs grew louder. Used joint funds for the party. Secret credit card. The beach house was always hers. Then came the exodus. Guests began slipping out in pairs, avoiding eye contact with the stage. The string quartet packed up their instruments. A waiter quietly removed the cake still untouched, its golden 50 gleaming under the chandeliers like a cruel joke. I reached the grand foyer when I heard footsteps behind me, sharp, angry, familiar. Ellie. I turned. Beatrice stood there, her silver bob slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed with fury, her eyes burned with accusation. How could you do this to your brother? She hissed, voice low but venomous. Humiliate him in front of everyone? After everything he's given you? I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't do anything. Beatrice, I said calmly. I simply told the truth. I took a step closer. The diamond pendant caught the light from the chandelier above, casting a sharp glint across her face. Something your family seems to have forgotten how to do. Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in 23 years, she had no retort, no manipulation, no polished lie to smooth over the rot beneath. She just stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. I turned and walked out the front doors. The night air was cool, scented with jasmine and salt from the bay. A town car idled at the curb, prearranged, just in case. The driver opened the door without a word as I slid into the back seat. I glanced back through the glass doors. Robert was alone on the stage now. Chloe was gone, vanished into the crowd or out a side exit. I didn't care which. The guests who remained stood in small, tense groups, none of them looking at him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor like a man who just realized the ground had vanished beneath him. His empire built on charm, deception, and other people's trust had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. And the saddest part, he'd built the stage himself. The car pulled away from the curb. I didn't look back again. In my purse, my phone buzzed. A text from Miriam. Martin Reeves just called. He wants to meet Monday. He's cutting ties with Robert. You were right. I smiled faintly and tucked the phone away. The city lights blurred past the window, golden, distant, indifferent. I touched the diamond at my throat one last time, then unclasped it. I placed it in the console between the seats. A relic of a life I no longer needed. Tomorrow, I'd return the pendant to Robert's lawyer with a note. Consider this my gift to your new beginning. But tonight, I was free, and for the first time in years. The road ahead wasn't paved with his plans, it was mine to walk. 3 months later, I stood in the golden hush of a Napa Valley morning, my boots dusted with red earth, my hands stained with grape juice. The harvest had begun. Round me, workers moved through the rows of Cabernet Sauvignon vines, their voices low and rhythmic, baskets filling with clusters of deep purple fruit. The air smelled of sun-warmed leaves, damp soil, and the faint, sweet tang of fermentation from last year's barrels resting in the stone cellar below. This was my life now, not the polished marble and hushed whispers of Robert's world, but something real, rooted, alive. I'd moved into the farmhouse the week after the party, not in a rush, not in anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone stepping into a room they've always belonged in. The walls were old, the floors creaked, and the kitchen window looked out over the very slope where Robert once stood, and called my dream unrealistic. Now, that slope fed my future. The legal dust had settled faster than I expected. Robert's business partner, Martin, severed ties within days. Without his credibility and with Miriam quietly sharing just enough evidence to make lenders nervous, Robert's firm collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. He sold his shares for a fraction of their worth. The penthouse in the city? Listed, then sold. Even the car he leased for Chloe was repossessed. Last I heard, he was living in Beatrice's guest house in Marin, a small, sunless room above her garage. Poetic, in its own way. As for Chloe, a mutual acquaintance told me she'd been seen at a wine bar in Soho, laughing with a man twice her age and half Robert's charm. Some people don't want love. They just want someone to pay for the illusion of it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Justice wasn't something I took. It was something that grew slowly, patiently from the seeds of truth I'd planted that night. I walked down to the tasting room, where a small sign now read, Langley Vineyards, the State, 1947, Reborn 2025. Inside, shelves held our first official release, a bold Cabernet I'd named Second Chapter. The label was simple, just the vineyard, the year, and a single line in elegant script. Some endings are just new roots. A tour group arrived, mostly women in their 50s and 60s, laughing, snapping photos. One of them recognized me. "You're her, aren't you?" she asked softly. "The woman from the party." I smiled. "I am." She didn't ask for details. She just squeezed my arm and said, "I'm glad you're here." So was I that evening. As the sun dipped behind the Mayacamas mountains, I poured myself a glass of the new vintage. The wine was deep ruby, full-bodied, with notes of blackberry, cedar, and something I could only describe as resilience. I stepped onto the porch and raised my glass to the horizon. The sky blazed orange and violet, the vines stretching out like dark veins against the fading light. In that moment, I thought of Robert, not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. He thought he was erasing me, but in trying to rewrite my story, he handed me the pen, and I wrote a better ending, one where I wasn't defined by his betrayal, but by my own courage, where my worth wasn't tied to a marriage, but to the life I built from the truth, where peace wasn't the absence of pain but the presence of purpose. The diamond pendant? I donated it to a women's shelter in Oakland, with a note, "For the woman who's about to find her voice." I didn't need it anymore. What I needed was this: the smell of earth after rain, the sound of laughter in my kitchen, the weight of a full harvest basket in my arms. I took a slow sip. The wine was perfect, not because it was flawless but because it was mine. And as the last light touched the valley, I knew something with absolute clarity. Justice wasn't just served that night at the party. It was grown, it was tended, it was harvested, and now, at last, it was mine to savor. If you've ever been told your best days are behind you, don't believe it. Sometimes, your truest life begins the moment someone tries to end it for you. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story moved you, I'd be honored if you liked, shared, or left a comment below. Your voice matters, especially when it's finally ready to be heard.